Hello everyone, and welcome to the next edition of the Holland Land Office Museum's Artifact Video Series. My name is Ryan Duffy, I'm the director of the museum, and this week we are going to talk to you about one of the most prominent families in Batavia's history, and maybe the most important, the Richmonds. Specifically, I'm going to talk about husband and wife, Dean and Mary Richmond, who were responsible for creating most of the wealth and helping to build up Batavia and Genesee County. We'll start with Dean Richmond. Dean was born on March 31st, 1804 in Vermont, but his family soon moved to Syracuse when his father became heavily involved in the salt industry there. However, when Dean was only 14, his father passed away suddenly and he was forced to take over the business. And he did very well in it and actually made it very profitable and was able to support his mother and two sisters. As his business grew and grew, he soon expanded his reach throughout New York State, and this is where he actually meets his future wife, Mary Reed, soon to be Mary Richmond. They actually meet in Troy, where Mary was living, and she was actually an orphan, but they married on February 19th, 1833, and Mary would be with Dean for the rest of his life. Dean was not a man to sit still, though, and looked for new opportunities wherever he could. And by the 1830s, he saw something coming on the horizon, an industry that was going to prove to be so astronomical in its scope that he had to take the chance and jump at it. And this was the railroads. By 1842, he became heavily involved in railroads and actually moved to Buffalo, where he started a freight and transportation company based along the railroads. Between this and his success in the salt business, he was actually a very wealthy man, and he put this wealth to good use and became one of the wealthiest men in the Great Lakes region. With the importance of railroads, Dean moved the family to Attica first, and eventually to Batavia in 1852, where he was responsible for merging 12 separate individual railway lines into the New York Central Railroad. And it was at that time that they moved into their mansion, which became known as the Richmond Mansion, and added on improvements after improvements over their time there. With his success with the New York Central Railroad, he was promoted up through the ranks, first as the first vice president, then the second president after the retirement of Erastus Corning in 1864. And eventually, by 1866, he was the president of the New York Central Railroad. And he, during his leadership positions, instituted several improvements to the railroads that became pivotal to its success. The first was to build a bridge over the Hudson River between Albany and Troy, and he also doubled the system's mileage of track, which is pretty impressive over a couple years. And he was one of the first proponents of steel rail. However, Dean was not just a brilliant businessman, he was actually a very good politician on top of that. And one could say maybe he was ahead of his time in his recognition of the importance of bipartisanship. Dean was a Democrat, however, you'll see he had several close friends who were on the other side of the political spectrum in what becomes the Republican Party. But Dean served as the chairman for the Democratic State Committee from 1857 until his death in 1866. However, when Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860, Dean actually offered up his personal engine, the Dean Richmond, to take Lincoln across New York State on his inaugural tour. And the Dean Richmond would pull Lincoln again after Lincoln's assassination on the trek back to Springfield, Illinois on his funeral train. The Dean Richmond actually pulled the funeral train from Albany to Buffalo. Soon after the Civil War, Dean meets his end. While at a convention in Philadelphia, he becomes ill and dies very soon after. He dies on August 27th, 1866 at the age of 62. At his death, it is reported that Dean Richmond was worth $2.5 million. Now we are talking $2.5 million in 1866. So you can imagine what that might have been in today's dollars. However, his story does not truly end there, as his wife Mary Richmond continues on his legacy and success for almost another 30 years. Now Mary Meade Richmond was actually born in June 12th, 1813, in Troy, where soon after she loses both of her parents and is actually an orphan. After she marries Dean in 1833, she travels with him first to Buffalo, then to Attica, and then eventually settles here in Batavia. And this is where she makes her mark along with Dean. She becomes heavily involved in the community, both civically, socially, and commercially. One of their first big contributions is they actually donate a portion of their land to house the New York State School for the Blind. That was part of the reason why the school actually comes to Batavia, is that the Richmonds were willing to donate a considerable amount of land in order for it to be built. She also builds Batavia's public library, which is why it's called the Richmond Memorial Library. She actually built it in 1889 in honor of her son who passed away, and eventually gifted it to the city and the school district for use for all the public. And it's actually one of the most beautiful buildings in Batavia and still functions as a library today. And it was built directly behind the spot where the mansion used to stand. She also became heavily involved in many of the local successful businesses in Batavia, including Wire Plow, Johnson Harvester, Ian Rowell Box Factory, Baker Gun Factory. All of these cornerstones of Batavia business, she put some money into and helped them succeed, and also succeeded a lot in her own right. But she was also very important to the Holland Land Company and the Holland Land Office Museum. She was on the original board for the Holland Purchase Historical Society and was a main proponent of saving the building from being torn down in 1893. And she actually was the first president of the Historical Society until her death in 1895. Mary Richmond actually passes away on April 22nd, 1895. And it was reported that she had actually doubled Dean's wealth from his death, so we're looking at maybe $5 million she was worth at the time. Their home reflected that, as well, as it was probably the most beautiful mansion in Batavia and probably the most well-known. It survived until 1970 when it was torn down, but it not only housed the Richmonds, but in 1828 it became the county children's home and actually functioned in that capacity for quite a few decades. So even after their deaths, their home continued to serve the community in quite a big way. So here in the museum, when you come, you can see quite a few items from the Richmonds and their home. I'm standing in front of a portrait of Dean here, which is right above a fireplace mantle from their home. But we also have some of Dean's personal items and some other items from the Richmond Mansion, including a large pier glass mirror and a very large set of rosewood cabinets that actually came from the mansion. So I hope you enjoyed this week's edition of our Artifact video series and learned a little bit more about the Richmond family and their importance to Batavia.